This is the face of a princess, immortalized in one of the world's most famous paintings. But behind these innocent eyes lies a horrifying secret. She was born to be a bride for her own uncle. This is the tragic story of Margarita Teresa, a victim of royal incest, whose life was a sacrifice to a dying dynasty. Her fairy tale was a nightmare, and the curse that ran through her veins wouldn't just seal her own fate, it would bring an entire empire to its knees. She was a pawn in a centuries-long game of power, and her life became a heartbreaking example of personal suffering and the devastating cost of dynastic ambition. Her story doesn't start with a once upon a time, but with a family tree so tangled it looped back on itself. The House of Habsburg, one of the most powerful royal families in European history, had a dark and dangerous obsession, keeping their bloodline pure. For generations, they turned inward, marrying their own relatives to consolidate power and protect their vast territories. Uncles married nieces, and first cousins married first cousins. The result? A dynasty on the brink of genetic collapse. Margarita Teresa was born at the epicenter of this crisis, a fragile doll in a gilded cage, destined from birth for a fate she could never escape. To understand Margarita Teresa's tragedy, you have to understand the world she was born into. By the mid-17th century, the Spanish Habsburgs were a shadow of their former selves. The empire was crumbling under the weight of endless wars, economic decline, and most critically, a succession crisis. The dynasty was simply failing to produce healthy male heirs. The family's relentless inbreeding, a strategy designed to keep power, was now threatening to destroy it from within. Margarita's father was King Philip IV of Spain. His first wife and his only son and heir, Balthasar Charles, had both passed away. The prince's death was a devastating blow that plunged the Spanish court into a panic. Philip, now in his 40s, desperately needed another son to secure the future of his line. So he turned to the House of Habsburg's Austrian branch and to a familiar, chilling solution, marrying his own niece, Mariana of Austria. Mariana was actually supposed to marry her cousin, the prince who had just died. But with his death, her dynastic duty was simply reassigned. Instead of her cousin, she would now marry her uncle, a man nearly 30 years older than her. This wasn't seen as a shocking transgression, but as a political necessity, just another move in the Habsburg playbook. The genetic consequences, however, were staggering. The inbreeding coefficient of their future children would be over 0.25, a level of genetic similarity normally seen only between a brother and sister. In her recent ancestry, Margarita Teresa would have only 10 unique great-great-grandparents instead of the usual 32. The family tree had become a suffocating loop. On July 12, 1651, Mariana gave birth to a daughter, Margarita Teresa. In a court starved for good news, her arrival was celebrated. She was a beautiful, fair-haired, and seemingly healthy child. For her aging father, King Philip IV, she became the center of his world, a beacon of hope he called My Joy. But this fatherly love was tangled up with cold, political calculation. From the moment she was born, Margarita Teresa wasn't just a daughter. She was a political asset. She was a future bride whose marriage would be used to lock down the alliance between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family. Her intended groom was already chosen, her mother's brother and her own first cousin, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. She was betrothed to her uncle. Her childhood unfolded inside the rigid formality of the Spanish court at the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. It was a world of splendor and suffocating ritual, where every part of her life was governed by strict etiquette. Surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, tutors, and servants, she was still profoundly alone. Her days were a structured march of religious services, lessons, and formal appearances. This isolated childhood is captured in a series of extraordinary portraits by the court painter Diego Velázquez. Philip IV commissioned these paintings not just out of love, but as a form of political correspondence. The portraits were regularly sent to Vienna, to the court of her future husband, Leopold I, to show him the princess who would one day be his empress. They were progress reports on a future queen. The most famous of these is the masterpiece Las Meninas, painted in 1656. In it, a 5-year-old Margarita Teresa stands at the very center of the painting, a luminous figure in a grand, shadowy room. She's attended by her maids of honor, her chaperone, her bodyguard, and her court dwarfs. Even the king and queen are there, their reflections caught in a mirror on the back wall. The painting is a complex snapshot of court life, but at its heart is the small, serious-faced princess. She is the sun around which this entire universe orbits. Yet, her expression holds a melancholy beyond her years. She was already a public figure, a symbol of hope. Her childhood already a performance for a foreign court. As she grew, the physical signs of her heritage began to emerge. The Habsburgs were infamous for a specific genetic deformity caused by generations of inbreeding, the Habsburg jaw. This condition caused the lower jaw to grow too long, often resulting in a severe underbite that could make it hard to speak or eat. While Margarita Teresa's case wasn't as severe as that of her younger brother, the tragic Charles II, the trait was there, a subtle mark of her family's poisoned bloodline. In the portraits sent to Vienna, Velázquez, a master of both realism and flattery, skillfully softened this feature, presenting a more idealized princess for her future husband. Her education was focused entirely on preparing her to be empress. She learned languages, music, and dance, but above all, she was taught a deep Catholic faith and a profound sense of duty. She understood from a young age that her body was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty, and her purpose was to forge an alliance and produce heirs. The weight of this destiny was immense. Her gilded cage was beautiful, but it was a cage, and the door was about to open, leading not to freedom, but to another court, another uncle, and the ultimate sacrifice. For the Habsburgs, marriage was almost never about love, it was about strategy. The union between Margarita Teresa and Leopold I was a geopolitical move that had been decades in the making. It was designed to do one thing: consolidate Habsburg power against their great rival, France, led by the ambitious King Louis XIV. By binding the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family together, they hoped to create a united Catholic front that could dominate Europe. Margarita Teresa was the key to this entire strategy. Leopold I was a complex man. Like Margarita, he was a product of the Habsburg gene pool and had the characteristic family jaw. He was her maternal uncle, but also her paternal cousin, a perfect example of the family's tangled web. He was a deeply serious man, known for his devotion to Catholicism, his love of music, and his often indecisive nature. He had waited patiently for his young Spanish bride, watching her grow up through the portraits sent from Madrid. In the winter of 1666, after years of delays caused by politics and the death of her father, the time finally came for 15-year-old Margarita to fulfill her destiny. Leaving Spain was a grand, somber affair. She said goodbye to her mother, her court, and the only home she'd ever known. She was now the Infanta Empress, a title that carried the weight of two empires on its shoulders. The journey to Vienna was an arduous, months-long trek across land and sea, a rolling spectacle of Habsburg power designed to impress everyone it passed. But for Margarita Teresa, it must have been a terrifying leap from the familiar world of Madrid to an unknown future. She arrived in Vienna to a series of lavish, overwhelming celebrations. Leopold, eager to welcome his bride, staged magnificent pageants, ballets, and even an opera commissioned just for the occasion. The festivities were meant to celebrate the union of two great powers, but they also served to introduce the young empress to her new home. The Viennese court, however, was a world away from the stiff formality of Madrid. While both were Catholic and ruled by Habsburgs, the Austrian court was more vibrant, more boisterous, and more influenced by Italian and French culture. For Margarita Teresa, raised in the rigid, almost monastic world of the Spanish Alcazar, it was a profound culture shock. She clung fiercely to her Spanish identity, continuing to speak her native language and surrounding herself with her Spanish retinue. This created a deep rift at court. The Austrian courtiers saw the new empress and her entourage as arrogant and unwilling to assimilate. They mocked her Spanish customs and her intense piety. Margarita Teresa, in turn, found the Austrians frivolous and disrespectful. She became an isolated figure at the heart of her own court, a Spanish island in a German sea. Her main support was her husband, Leopold. Despite the age gap and the unnatural circumstances of their union, the marriage seems to have been genuinely affectionate. Leopold was enchanted by his young wife, whom he called Gretel, and he showered her with attention. They shared a passion for music and theater, and for a while, It seemed the young empress might find some happiness. But any personal joy was overshadowed by the immense pressure of her dynastic duty. She had to produce a male heir. The succession of both the Austrian and Spanish thrones hung in the balance. Back in Spain, Margarita's younger brother, Charles II, was growing into a frail and sickly child. It was becoming clear that he was profoundly disabled, a tragic result of the family's inbreeding. As the last male of the Spanish Habsburg line, many doubted he would live long, let alone have a child of his own. If Charles died without an heir, the Spanish throne would pass through the female line. Margarita Teresa, as his eldest sister, had a strong claim. A son born to her and Leopold could therefore inherit not only the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian lands, but also the vast global empire of Spain. He would reunite the Habsburg domains, restoring the family to its former glory. The fate of a continent rested in her womb. The pressure was unimaginable. The court watched her, waiting, scrutinizing her for any sign of pregnancy. Her body was no longer just a symbol of an alliance. It was the potential vessel for the salvation of her dynasty. Margarita Teresa, the little girl from Las Meninas, was now at the center of the Habsburgs' final, desperate gamble. Her personal tragedy was about to begin in earnest, as the demands of the dynasty began to take their devastating toll on her fragile body. The 6 years of Margarita Teresa's marriage were a brutal, relentless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and grief. Her life in Vienna became a frantic race against time to fulfill her dynastic obligation before her body, weakened by a flawed genetic inheritance, simply gave out. Between 1667 and her death in 1673, the young empress endured a punishing series of pregnancies that shattered her health and her spirit. Her first pregnancy came quickly, sparking celebration across the empire. In 1667, she gave birth to a son, Ferdinand Wenceslas. But the joy was tragically short-lived. The infant was frail and died before his first birthday. The loss was a devastating blow, not just personally for the young parents, but politically for the dynasty. Margarita was plunged into grief, but the court gave her no time to mourn. The pressure for another heir was immediate. Soon, she was pregnant again. In 1669, she gave birth to a daughter, Maria Antonia. A daughter was a disappointment, not the male heir the empire craved, but she was a healthy child, a small glimmer of hope. Maria Antonia would be the only one of Margarita's children to survive into adulthood. But the cycle continued. Historians confirm 4 live births, but she also suffered several miscarriages, each one taking a greater toll on her increasingly fragile health. The nursery at the Hofburg Palace became a place of sorrow, a testament to the genetic curse that haunted the Habsburgs. Of the 4 children she brought into the world, 3 were lost in infancy. These repeated tragedies are now seen by historians as the direct consequences of inbreeding. Margarita Teresa's body, for all its symbolic importance, simply couldn't overcome the lethal inheritance of her bloodline. Her physical decline was rapid. The vibrant young princess from the portraits was gone, replaced by a pale, weary woman. The constant pregnancies left her perpetually exhausted. She suffered from a goiter, a swelling of the neck that was another likely side effect of the family's limited gene pool. Her psychological state deteriorated with her physical health. She became even more devout, perhaps seeing her inability to produce a healthy son as a form of divine punishment. In her distress, influenced by the fanatical piety of her Spanish upbringing, she looked for scapegoats. She became convinced that the Jewish community in Vienna was the source of her misfortune and relentlessly pressured her husband to expel them, blaming them for her tragedies. While Leopold's decision was undoubtedly complex, driven by multiple political and financial factors, the empress's influence provided a powerful justification. In 1670, Vienna's Jewish population was violently expelled. It is a dark chapter in her story, reflecting the desperate mindset that took hold as her world crumbled. Her isolation at court only deepened her misery. She remained a foreigner, this Spanish empress, viewed with resentment by the Austrian nobility. Her only real solace was her husband, who, despite his own disappointment, remained devoted to her. But his affection couldn't protect her from the court's machinations or the relentless demands of her own body. In early 1673, Margarita Teresa was pregnant yet again. She was only 21, but her body was worn down by a lifetime of physical and emotional strain. For months into this final pregnancy, her health failed completely. On March 12, 1673, Margarita Teresa of Spain, Holy Roman Empress, died. She was just 21 years old. The official cause was complications from her pregnancy, but the true cause was her heritage. She was a victim of a dynastic strategy that prized power over people, a sacrifice on the altar of the Habsburg name. The story of Margarita Teresa is a powerful reminder of how the grand sweep of history is often built on individual human suffering. Her life wasn't a fairy tale, but a cautionary tale, one of many dark stories hidden behind palace walls. If you believe these forgotten histories deserve to be told, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the shocking and overlooked corners of the past. Sharing this video helps us bring more of these important stories to light. The death of Margarita Teresa sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe, but the dynastic game didn't stop. Leopold I, though reportedly heartbroken, knew his duty. He needed an heir and would marry 2 more times, eventually fathering a healthy son to succeed him. But the question of the Spanish succession remained a ticking time bomb. Margarita's legacy was carried on by her only surviving child, her daughter Maria Antonia, who inherited her mother's claim to the Spanish throne. This claim made her one of the most important heiresses in Europe. She was married off to the Elector of Bavaria and gave birth to a son, Joseph Ferdinand. For a moment, it seemed this boy could be the compromise heir who could inherit the Spanish Empire and prevent a catastrophic war. But the Habsburg curse was relentless. Like his uncles, Joseph Ferdinand died in childhood. With his death, the claims to the Spanish throne fell to the 2 great rival powers, the Austrian Habsburgs and the French Bourbons. The stage was set for a conflict that would engulf the continent. Meanwhile, in Spain, Margarita Teresa's brother, Charles II, withered away. As the final, tragic product of Habsburg inbreeding, he was plagued by physical and mental disabilities and was unable to produce an heir. He ruled as a specter, the living embodiment of his dynasty's decay. When he finally died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line became extinct. His death triggered the very conflict everyone had feared, the War of the Spanish Succession. The war raged for over a decade, reshaping the map of Europe and ultimately shattering the Habsburgs' centuries-long dominance. In the end, all the sacrifices, all the inbred marriages, and all the personal suffering were for nothing. The strategy meant to preserve the dynasty led directly to its destruction. Margarita Teresa's life stands as the most poignant symbol of this failure. When we look at her portraits today, especially the innocent 5-year-old at the center of Las Meninas, we see more than just a princess. We see the human cost of ambition, a life sacrificed for a dying cause. She was the pearl of the dynasty, beautiful and precious, but ultimately crushed by the immense pressure of her own legacy.